Good morning. It's a pleasure to address the WASH and Wellbeing conference. Thank you so much for having invited me to address you, and I'm so sorry for not being able to be physically with you today. I am, at the time that you will listen to me, I will be in Bolivia for a regional consultation that I'm hosting in the framework of my work as Special Rapporteur of the UN on the rights to water and sanitation. As you might know, I have been working on this mandate on the rights to water and sanitation since 2008, when the mandate was established. So I'm the first one to hold this mandate, and during these past 5 years, I've had the occasion to be in touch with many people during my country missions, which have systematically put the focus on people who have been most vulnerable, most marginalized, most excluded in societies. And obviously one of the groups I've been in contact with is the group of indigenous peoples organizations. And this has occurred not only, as I was saying, during my country missions, but also through other meetings and also correspondence that I've had. Like in so many human rights, indigenous peoples suffer disproportionate violations of the rights their rights to sanitation and to water. So I would like today to talk about what the human right to water and sanitation is, and also to speak about the types of violations which have been raised to me in my capacity as Special Rapporteur on the rights to water and sanitation that are linked with indigenous people's rights. I would like also to touch upon some of the measures that we can take to address these violations, and finally I would like to talk about human rights more broadly and how the human rights that and how the human rights framework can be used to analyze the special relationships that indigenous people have to and with water. So we know that almost nearly 1 billion people in the world do not have access to improved water sources. We do not know how many people in the world don't have access to safe water. The unofficial estimates say maybe 1.8 billion people do not have access to safe water, and 2.5 billion people do not have access to adequate sanitation, while almost around 1 billion people practice open defecation on a daily basis. Open defecation being an euphemism to describe the situation of people who have to find a place to hide, to do their business daily. Suffering not only indignity, but also very often, as you might know, in the case of women and girls, violence, including sexual violence. The worst about the situation is, and about the figures that I mentioned to you, is that they do not capture gaps, they do not capture inequalities, they don't capture discrimination, they don't capture stigma that some groups of the population systematically face. They are aggregate numbers. And precisely what the human rights to water and sanitation say is that these gaps, these inequalities have to be eliminated. They have to be eliminated progressively between the rich and the poor, between people living in formal and informal settlements, people living in rural and urban areas, indigenous people and the average population, people belonging to ethnic minorities and the majority population, people belonging to castes, etc. So people who are traditionally forgotten, left behind, etc. So basically what also the human rights framework says, beyond the issue of non-discrimination and elimination of inequalities, it also determines that water and sanitation have to be available, accessible, affordable, of quality, and also culturally and socially acceptable for everyone. In the case of sanitation, human rights also means that sanitation solutions have to ensure privacy, protect dignity for all. So when we look at, on the one hand, the numbers that I just mentioned, the billions, and on the other hand, at the legal framework, we see, well, that there is a disconnect and that we are really facing a severe crisis when it comes to realizing the rights to water and sanitation for all. And even the numbers that I mentioned to you, as I said, do not tell us the profound discrimination that is taking place against certain groups in the world. What human rights also tell us is that we must constantly ask. We must constantly ask who does not have access and why. And in my country missions, I've seen that it's always the same people who are excluded. The people who have no political voice, the people who belong to the groups I mentioned, and in the countries that have indigenous populations, too frequently it is also these communities who do not have access to water and sanitation. Such lack of access is not simply an unfortunate situation or a coincidence, but it is a direct result of policies and politics which exclude certain segments of the population, implicitly or explicitly, directly or indirectly, but they are excluded. My very first country mission, my country visit in 2009 was to Costa Rica. I examined numerous issues related to sanitation and water there, giving also attention to the situation of indigenous people. Let us recall that Costa Rica is on track to meet the MDGs on water and sanitation, which is obviously commendable. However, I was dismayed by the lack of attention towards improving the situation of indigenous peoples. The vast majority of indigenous people living in the 24 reserves in the country do not have access to safe drinking water or sanitation services, compared with nearly universal access in urban areas and very high access rates in other rural areas. Hence, I was concerned about the country's focus on the general positive trend in providing access to water and sanitation to the overall population, while overlooking the fact that specific, targeted and deliberate policies and measures are needed to make sure that progress also reaches the excluded segments of the population, including the indigenous peoples. As Special Rapporteur, I also regularly receive information about threats to indigenous rights, including especially concerns about pollution of water sources. For example, I received numerous reports about the impact of mining operations, from uranium mining in the USA to bauxite mining in India. Indigenous peoples are seeing severe impacts on their access to clean water as well as on their way of life and culture. Projects to generate new sources of energy, such as dams and geothermal exploration, have also been reported to me as having a serious impact on access to clean water for indigenous people. As the people in your room know well, indigenous peoples have often a special or even spiritual relation with water. I witnessed this special bond when I visited the Winnemem Wintu tribe in California some years ago during my country mission to the USA. This tribe uses the local river, the McLeod River, for spiritual and ceremonial purposes. For example, they hold the puberty ceremony, which honors the coming of age for young women who have to swim across the river and join tribal dancers as a full-fledged woman. However, the area used has been turned into a recreational campground serviced by the U.S. Forest Services, where the presence of tourists, campers and boaters challenges the privacy and dignity of the young women undergoing the ceremony, as well as the continuation of tribal practices. The activism of indigenous communities has been crucial in bringing these situations to light. And I hope that your conference will be another opportunity to expose and discuss these and other human rights violations and find ways to pressure governments to ensure that indigenous rights are fully respected. Some years ago, over the past years, a groundbreaking litigation in Botswana has also taken place by the Basara concerning the right to water. The Basara has been denied access to a borehole which they had been using for decades as part of an attempt to get them to move out of the game reserve where they had been living even before its designation as a reserve. This decision was very important, not only adding to jurisprudence protecting indigenous rights to remain on their ancestral lands, but also further solidifying the status of the right to water under international law. The court referred to the General Assembly resolution on the right to water and sanitation from 2010 and found that denying the Basara permission to use at their own expense the borehole located on the land where they resided amounted to degrading treatment, which is prohibited inter alia under the UN Convention Against Torture. I was very excited about this case for many reasons, but most of all because the court very wisely observed the indivisibility of human rights, talking about water, traditionally considered as an economic, social and cultural right, in the same breath as degrading treatment, generally known as a civil and political right, is something to applaud. I think that too often we lose sight of the invisibility of human rights, and specifically for indigenous people, we need to consider enjoyment of human rights in a holistic way. This holistic understanding is crucial for analyzing indigenous rights and also the rights to water and sanitation. The right to water and sanitation, as I mentioned, provides that everyone should have access to sufficient, safe, affordable and acceptable water and sanitation for personal and domestic uses. With regard to water, this means water for drinking, for cooking, for washing clothes and dishes, and also for basic personal hygiene. Water for agriculture falls under the rubric of the right to food, and water for cultural and spiritual life comes within the understanding of cultural rights, as well as specific rights guaranteed to indigenous peoples. Clearly, these lines get blurred all the time, and individuals do not categorize their water uses into these rigid categories of human rights. To understand the individual experience and the loss of dignity which can occur when access to water is denied, we must take a holistic view. As you may know, my mandate is a part of a larger system that is called the Special Procedures System. We are experts appointed by the Human Rights Council of the UN to examine specific themes related to human rights. James Anaya, the Special Rapporteur on the rights of indigenous people, is also part of the system. But there are also other experts on the right to food, to health, education, torture, arbitrary detention, and so on. You might know these mandates, you might even have been in touch with them. We have the capacity to work jointly to raise concerns about situations of violations of indigenous people's rights. What I see when I receive information related to water and indigenous peoples is that these complaints very often also concern many other mandates. When violations of the rights to water are being experienced, sadly, a host of other deprivations and violations are also reported. I would like to conclude by encouraging people fighting for indigenous people's rights to continue to engage with the international human rights system, including with the system of special procedures, as well as with the system of treaty bodies, the committees of the UN and the Universal Periodic Review of the Human Rights Council. I express my full support to activism at the national, regional levels as well, and I know the sense of frustration that many of you might feel in the interaction with the UN and with regional bodies. They don't react as quickly and as effectively as you would hope. Their impact is not as pronounced as you would wish. Rest assured, because I feel exactly the same. However, these efforts are crucial for ending ongoing violations of indigenous people's rights, including those rights related to water, and to improving their enjoyment of all human rights. The fact that things are hard, the circumstance that sometimes we do not see the light at the end of the tunnel, is not a reason for giving up. On the contrary, as my favorite Portuguese poet Pessoa once put it, stones in the path, I collect them all. One day I will build a castle. I thank you very much for your attention, and again I'm very sorry for not being able to participate in the discussion that you will have, but I hope that other occasions will materialize where we will be able to talk about the rights to water and sanitation, indigenous people's rights, and how to implement these rights. Before ending, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that I am currently working on a handbook on how to implement the rights to water and sanitation. If you go to my website, you will find information on the work that I'm undertaking, and also on 2 e-consultations, online consultations that I'm organizing on the handbook. And I am happy to receive information regarding, well, good practices, yes, but also alleged violations, regarding constraints, bottlenecks, difficulties that that organizations feel, experience at the national level for making sure that these rights are fully implemented. So I'm looking forward to receiving also your input and hope, as I said before, that we stay in touch. Thank you so much for your attention.